The Bible presents us with many fascinating figures, and among them, we find two mysterious creatures in the book of Job, Leviathan and Behemoth. In chapter 41, God describes these creatures during his conversation with Job, while showing him his immense power and control over all things. But who are these creatures? Are they symbols, real animals, or something else? The book of Job is one of the most profound and complex narratives in the Bible. It tells us the story of a righteous man who went through extreme suffering. Job lost his family, his possessions, and his health all in a short period of time. Faced with so much pain, he began to question God, trying to understand the reason for all of this. In his dialogues with his friends and, later, directly with God, Job sought answers about the reason for so much suffering. However, when God finally answers him, he does not give a direct explanation about the reasons for his pain. Instead, God leads Job to reflect on the grandeur of creation. God begins to describe various works of nature, showing Job that human beings are not capable of understanding or controlling all things. He mentions everything from the stars in the sky to the wildest creatures on earth, including two gigantic and mysterious figures, Behemoth and Leviathan. These creatures are described in detail to highlight God's incomparable power and, at the same time, the limitations of human understanding. The central message is clear: God, who created and controls everything in the universe, cannot be fully understood by finite minds like ours. In the midst of all this, we have Behemoth, mentioned in Job 40 verses 15 to 24, one of the most intriguing creatures described in the Bible. In the midst of the dialogue between God and Job, the Lord highlights the grandeur of his creations and uses Behemoth as an example of something so strong and imposing that man is incapable of dominating it. The purpose of this description is to show Job and us the insignificance of man in the face of God's creative and sovereign power. The first thing God mentions about Behemoth is that it is a herbivorous creature, eating grass like an ox. Job 40 verse 15. This may seem like a simple detail, but it reveals something interesting. Despite being immense and incredibly strong, Behemoth is peaceful in its diet, eating only plants. Yet the creature's physical strength is extraordinary. God goes on to describe its thighs as powerful and its bones as tubes of bronze and rods of iron. Job 40 verse 18. These comparisons indicate a tough, virtually indestructible physical structure. Behemoth is described as a creature of colossal size and unparalleled strength. Its description suggests that while man can dominate some animals, Behemoth is so imposing that only God has the power to control it. This is emphasized in verse 19, where God says that Behemoth is the first of God's works. He who made it has equipped it with a sword. Here, first could refer to its grandeur or importance among earthly creatures, and the fact that God is the only one capable of dominating it further underscores divine sovereignty. Many scholars and theologians over the centuries have attempted to identify Behemoth as a real animal. Among the most common theories, some believe that it could be a hippopotamus, due to its large size, herbivorous diet, and remarkable strength. Others suggest that it could be an elephant, another herbivorous creature of gigantic proportions. Both creatures have powerful thighs and an imposing presence in the animal kingdom, which fits parts of Behemoth's description. However, there is a school of thought that believes that Behemoth does not refer to a specific animal, but rather to a mythical or symbolic creature. The description of its bones as tubes of bronze and rods of iron may be a metaphor to show its unparalleled strength, something that goes beyond the creatures we know. Furthermore, the fact that it is so formidable that only God can control it may suggest that Behemoth is more than just an animal. It may represent a greater force of nature or even a personification of God's indomitable creation. This interpretation suggests that Behemoth is a symbol of the raw strength and stability that exist in nature, but at the same time, it is under God's complete control. This reiterates the central message of God's speech to Job. Humans have no control over the world around them, but God, in his wisdom and power, controls everything. Behemoth, then, serves as a reminder of our limitations and the greatness of the Creator. On the other hand, some theological interpretations view Behemoth as a figure representing the forces of chaos or evil that God subdues. Although the text of Job does not directly imply that Behemoth is an evil creature, its imposing description and the emphasis on God's sovereignty over it may suggest that this creature symbolizes chaos or the disorder that God keeps under control. However the behemoth is interpreted as a real animal, a mythical creature, or a symbol of greater forces, the lesson is clear: God is sovereign over all. The behemoth, despite its colossal strength, is completely subject to divine control. This is a powerful message for Job and for us. Even the forces that seem uncontrollable are in God's hands. In this way, the behemoth reminds us that, no matter how much human knowledge and technology has advanced, there are limits to what we can do or control. However, these limits do not apply to God, who has dominion over all things, from the smallest creatures to the grandest. The Leviathan is one of the most fascinating and mysterious creatures mentioned in the Bible. In Job 41, God challenges Job to consider the Leviathan, a sea creature that is described as fearsome and untamable. It is depicted as a beast covered in impenetrable scales, with unparalleled destructive power. This creature fears no one, and its actions cause terror wherever it goes. Its description is so impressive that God uses Leviathan as an example to show Job how small and powerless human beings are in the face of divine greatness and sovereignty. In the text, Leviathan is presented as a sea animal with a shell so resistant that no human weapon is capable of piercing it. Job 41 verse 7 asks rhetorically, "Can you fill its skin with harpoons or its head with fishing darts?" The answer is obvious. No, Leviathan is a creature invulnerable to human attacks. This reveals that, no matter how hard man tries, he has no control over certain forces of nature. Only God can dominate something so powerful and implacable. In addition, the description of Leviathan continues with details that make it even more frightening. It is portrayed as a creature capable of breathing fire and making smoke come out of its nostrils. Job 41 verses 19 to 21. These images may seem fantastical or even mythological, but they serve to intensify how terrifying and destructive the Leviathan is. It is seen as something that cannot be tamed or controlled by human hands, a symbol of brute force, a creature that spreads chaos wherever it goes. Another interesting detail about Leviathan is that he fears no one. Job 41 verse 33 states, "There is none like him on earth, for he was made to be without fear." This further reinforces his indomitable nature and the powerlessness of man in the face of him. Any attempt to confront him would be futile, which highlights God's message to Job. If man cannot control creatures like Leviathan, who are we to question God or challenge his wisdom? Many ancient cultures also had figures similar to Leviathan, representing sea monsters or chaotic forces. However, in the Bible, Leviathan is used to point to the greatness of God. He represents the chaos that man cannot control, but that God easily dominates. The mention of Leviathan in other biblical texts, such as Psalm 74 verse 14 and Isaiah 27 verse 1, reinforce this idea. In some contexts, Leviathan is also associated with evil or primordial chaos, something that God overcomes and subdues. It is a creature that symbolizes the uncontrollable power of nature and the forces that humans cannot control. It is a visual reminder of human limitation and God's sovereignty over all creation. As Job, in his anguish, sought answers to his suffering, God used Leviathan to show that not all things are within human understanding or control. The only certainty is that God, the Creator, has dominion over all things, no matter how great and fearsome they may be. Leviathan, then, is not just a sea monster, but a metaphor for God's immense and unquestionable power. Its description in Job 41 is one of the most impressive and detailed in the Bible, highlighting the power and majesty of God through this indomitable creature. God challenges Job with the question, "Can you fish Leviathan with a hook or catch his tongue with a rope?" Job 41 verse 1. This question already indicates the impossibility of any human being subduing such a powerful and frightening creature. Leviathan is much more than a simple sea animal. It is a symbol of God's great and indomitable creation. The monster is described as invincible. Its scales are one of its main characteristics. They are so compact and well-fitted that no air passes through them. Job 41 verse 16. This creates the image of an impenetrable armor, which protects Leviathan from any attack or attempt at capture. This total protection reinforces the idea that it is invulnerable to human efforts, whether with weapons or traps. At a time when hunting was a way to demonstrate power and control over nature, Leviathan is at an unattainable level, as no hunter would stand a chance against it. Another impressive detail is the description of its mouth and teeth. God says that his mouth is encompassed with terror, Job 41 verse 14, and his teeth are powerful and terrifying weapons. This suggests that in addition to his physical invulnerability, Leviathan is also a dangerous creature, capable of causing destruction and fear to anyone who comes near him. The imagery becomes even more startling when God describes Leviathan's breath. In Job 41 verse 21, we read that his breath kindles coals, and a flame comes out of his mouth. This description is reminiscent of mythological creatures, such as dragons, which are often associated with destruction and chaos. While it may be a metaphor, this vision of fire and smoke coming out of his mouth reinforces the destructive power and imposing nature of this creature. Leviathan is not only physically strong, he is practically a force of nature. Verse 25 continues to describe the impact that Leviathan has. When he rises, the mighty are afraid, and because of his shock they are dismayed. This shows that even the bravest and most prepared warriors tremble before him. Leviathan is beyond human courage, instilling fear and submission in all who encounter him. He is not a creature that one can face with conventional weapons such as arrows, swords, or spears. All of these are ineffective against him. However, the most important point that God wants to teach Job, and us through this detailed description, is that as terrible as Leviathan is, it is part of God's creation and is under his complete control. Even this invincible and fearsome creature is governed by God's will. Thus, the description of Leviathan serves not only to impress us with its strength, but to remind us of the immensity of God's power, which surpasses any creation, no matter how powerful. While man cannot tame Leviathan, God did and has dominion over it. This comparison is the heart of God's message to Job. If Job cannot control or understand creatures like Leviathan, how could he possibly fully comprehend God's plans and mysteries? Leviathan, with all its grandeur and danger, is a small part of God's vast and perfect plan. This vivid description of the creature, then, not only underscores God's incomparable power, but also reminds us of our own smallness before him. From this, we can learn to trust God, even when we do not understand his actions or the reason for our suffering. The question of whether Leviathan and Behemoth are real animals or symbols is one of the most intriguing debates surrounding the writings of Job. The descriptions of these creatures are so detailed and powerful that they generate different interpretations. Some Bible scholars believe that these creatures may be exaggerated versions of familiar animals, while others see in them a much deeper symbolic meaning. In the case of Behemoth, described in Job 40 verses 15 to 24, some suggest that it could be a hippopotamus or an elephant. After all, it is depicted as an animal that eats grass like an ox, but is incredibly strong, with powerful muscles and bones as firm as iron bars. The hippopotamus, in particular, is a creature of great strength and presence, especially in the Middle Eastern regions where the Book of Job is set. The idea that Behemoth is a real animal aligns with this local reality. Leviathan, mentioned in Job 41, is often compared to a crocodile or a whale. The description of a sea creature with impenetrable scales, a mouth full of teeth, and a breath that ignites fire seems exaggerated. But some believe that God is using the crocodile image to make a point about how terrifying and uncontrollable this creature can be. However, the image of Leviathan breathing fire and destroying everything around it goes beyond what one would expect from a crocodile or a whale. On the other hand, many people argue that Leviathan and Behemoth are more than just animals. They believe that these beings represent forces of chaos and creation that man cannot control. Leviathan, for example, is often associated with primordial chaos in many ancient cultures. In the Bible, it can be seen as a symbol of disorder that only God can control. This reflects the uncontrollable nature of creation, which is at once beautiful and destructive, yet completely subject to God's power. The The grandiose description of these creatures in Job is intentional to highlight that, even though there are uncontrollable forces in the world, God is above them all. The central message is not just about the power of these creatures, but about God's sovereignty over all creation, whether visible or invisible, real or symbolic. In Psalm 74 verse 14 and Isaiah 27 verse 1, Leviathan appears as an enemy defeated by God, reinforcing this image of a chaotic force subdued by the Creator. These passages support the idea that Leviathan may be more than just a real animal. It may represent spiritual forces, disorder, or even evil. So the question is not just whether these creatures are real animals or symbols, but what they represent in terms of divine power. The detailed and grandiose description of these creatures serves to remind us of man's limitations in the face of such a vast and complex universe, where even the most powerful and terrifying beings are under God's control. The debate over whether these creatures are real or symbolic continues, but the most important point remains. Whether Leviathan is a giant crocodile or a mythical monster, and Behemoth a hippopotamus or a symbolic force, the message is clear. God has power over everything, and man must recognize his position in this reality. God's purpose in mentioning Behemoth and Leviathan to Job was not just to speak of grand and mysterious creatures, but rather to highlight his immense power and control over all creation. In a moment of deep pain and questioning, Job was searching for answers to the suffering he was experiencing. Rather than giving direct explanations as to why he was suffering, God led him to reflect on something much greater: his sovereignty and the power he has over the world, including such impressive creatures as Behemoth and Leviathan. These gigantic creatures, with their impressive strength, are used by God as symbols of indomitable power. Behemoth, with its bones like iron bars and strong muscles, and Leviathan, with its impenetrable scales and fire-breathing breath, seem invincible and terrifying. However, the main point is not the size or ferocity of these animals, but the fact that God is in complete control of them. If he can rule over such formidable creatures, how much more could he have complete control over our lives, no matter how chaotic or painful they may seem? God wanted to show Job that just as he could not control Leviathan or Behemoth, he could not understand or control the mysteries of the universe and the divine will. But the great lesson here is that God has everything under his control. Even in the midst of chaos, struggles, and suffering, God is present, governing and taking care of everything. The power he exercises over these creatures is the same power he exercises over the universe and over the life of each human being. At times, just like Job, we too face situations that seem out of control, where we feel that chaos is taking over. However, what God teaches us through these creatures is that nothing escapes his hands. If he can control something as large and uncontrollable as Leviathan, then we can trust that he has the power to take care of us and lead us through our difficulties. The sovereignty of God, revealed in the descriptions of Behemoth and Leviathan, reminds us that we do not need to understand everything that happens in our lives. Our task is to trust in God, knowing that he is powerful enough to handle what is beyond our comprehension. Thus, the message he conveys to Job, and to all of us, is one of faith and trust. If God rules over the monsters of chaos, he can also rule over the monsters that appear in our own lives. This lesson of humility and trust is fundamental. God, in his infinite wisdom and power, knows what he is doing, even when we cannot see it. So, what we learn from the story of Job and the mention of these powerful creatures is that God is in control, always. And he, being sovereign over everything, is also watching over us at every moment, guiding us even through the most difficult situations. In Jewish culture, the Leviathan is often used as a symbol of evil or chaos that God will overcome in the end times. This terrifying figure, described as an invincible creature, represents not only a frightening animal, but also forces destructive and uncontrolled creatures that, despite their power, will be subdued by God. A clear example of this symbolic vision is in Isaiah 27 verse 1, where God promises to destroy Leviathan, the sea serpent monster. This verse says, "In that day the Lord will punish Leviathan, the swift serpent, Leviathan the crooked serpent, with his fierce and great and powerful sword, and he will slay the monster that is in the sea." Here, Leviathan is portrayed as a force of evil that God will completely defeat at the end of time, ensuring order and peace in the world. In addition to Isaiah, Leviathan is also mentioned in other Jewish texts, such as the Talmud, where it is spoken of as a giant creature that will be defeated in the future and whose flesh will be served at the banquet of the righteous. This reinforces the idea that Leviathan is not just an animal, but a powerful symbol of chaotic forces that God has under his control and that he will ultimately destroy completely. Jewish tradition, as well as other biblical writings, uses Leviathan to illustrate that, however terrible the forces of chaos may be, God is sovereign over them all. This figure, which appears in several ancient cultures as a sea monster, takes on a special meaning in the Bible. Leviathan becomes a representation of the forces that oppose divine order, but which will be defeated by the power of God. This symbolism of Leviathan as chaos and disorder can be compared to the challenges and difficulties we face in life. Just as Leviathan seems invincible, we often feel surrounded by situations that seem beyond our control. He will overcome even the most powerful forces that rise up against us.